and above all, engagement economically. Trade and investment flows between the United States and China started in the 1980s as reform and opening up got going. They were disrupted briefly after the Tiananmen Square incident of 1989. They resumed and expanded during the 1990s with the regular renewal of most favored nation status, and then they exploded after 2001 with China's entry into the World Trade Organization. So engagement. At the same time, successive U.S. administrations have worked to maintain a favorable balance of military power in the Asia-Pacific region by keeping U.S. forces there at the end of the Cold War and by working to strengthen ties with traditional U.S. allies like Japan, Korea, and Australia, and then also new quasi-alliance partners like Singapore and more recently India, countries to whom the United States doesn't extend security guarantees, but who share with it a concern about the implications of the rise of Chinese power. What were the objectives of this two-pronged strategy? Basically, to preserve stability, to deter aggression, while waiting for engagement to work its magic on China. It was expected, first, that over time, bringing China into the international system, into the global economy, into multilateral institutions, would encourage it to become what was referred to in the Bush administration as a responsible stakeholder in that existing system. A status quo power, a country whose leaders saw it as being in their interest to uphold the existing order rather than trying to change it fundamentally, still less to overthrow it. Secondly, it was anticipated that, particularly through deepening ties of trade and investment, the West would help to encourage and accelerate the process of economic liberalization, which was believed to be underway in China, and that would move China, it was expected, steadily towards a true Western-style market economy. And last but not least, although some people now are reluctant to admit that they actually said this, it is the case that there was a widely shared view that engagement with China would promote forces that would lead eventually to that country's political liberalization. And there was a particular theory about how this was going to work. Trade and investment would fuel growth. Growth would lead to the emergence and expansion of the middle class. And as had happened elsewhere in Europe and in Asia, historically going back to the 19th century, the middle class would act as the standard bearer for political reform. This belief, bolstered by liberal ideology and by modern social science theory, was widely shared on both sides of the American political aisle, and it became the single most important part of the public rationale for engagement. And just to pick one example, one representative quote, during the 2000 presidential campaign, George W. Bush, then candidate, Bush gave a speech in which he said, "Economic freedom creates habits of liberty, and habits of liberty create expectations of democracy. Trade freely with China, and time is on our side." Of course, American policy was not rooted entirely in altruism. There was also an expectation that trading freely with China would be good for the U.S. economy. Especially in the past decade, it's become apparent that this mixed approach has failed to achieve its central strategic objectives. China has grown far richer and much stronger, and has done so at an astonishing pace, and trade with China has benefited American consumers and at least some sectors of the U.S. economy. But the Chinese Communist Party regime has not liberalized, either politically or economically, and far from becoming a satisfied status quo power, China has begun to behave in ways that are assertive and even aggressive. It's attempting to alter the balance of power and is pursuing revisionist aims in its own immediate neighborhood and increasingly on the global level as well. And it's the dawning awareness of these realities that lies behind the current debate over whether, and if so how, to reshape the key elements of U.S.-China policy. So in the time that remains, I'd like to discuss in somewhat more detail the four troubling symptoms to which I referred a moment ago. The persistent and indeed growing repressiveness of the CCP regime, its continued and indeed expanding use of mercantilist economic policy tools, its increasingly evident regional revisionism and its emerging global ambitions. First, repression. The deepest cause of the failure of U.S. strategy can be found in the resilience, resolve, and ruthlessness of the Chinese Communist Party, its determination at all costs to retain its exclusive grip on domestic political power. And conversely, it's the CCP's success, the fact that China continues to be governed by a repressive one-party authoritarian regime, that lies at the heart of the many challenges that it poses to the United States and the world's other democracies. From the start, the CCP leadership was aware that the process of engaging with the outside world would be risky to its continued rule. Deng Xiaoping famously said that opening the windows would let in flies as well as fresh air, so subversive ideas. He believed that economic reform was essential to China's prospects for once again becoming a truly great power, but he was keenly aware that subversive ideas and outside influences could encourage dissent and produce unwanted pressures for political change. In other words, he feared that the Americans might be right. So, especially after what's referred to euphemistically as the 1989 Tiananmen incident, the CCP leadership put into place a set of policies meant to counteract and contain the potentially destabilizing political effects of economic reform. First, by allowing the Chinese people to enjoy more of the fruits of their own labors, the regime hoped to win their loyalty, or at least their continued acquiescence. In addition, and this is not new, but expanded, Beijing increased considerably its investments in the tools of surveillance and repression, including multiple domestic security forces and elaborate and increasingly expensive systems of control over the internet, and then somewhat more recently over social media. Last but not least, the regime designed and began to implement a major nationwide program of what was referred to as patriotic education, an ideological substitute for Marxism, Leninism, Maoism, which the regime recognized no longer had the appeal that it might once have had, particularly for younger people, that sought to bolster popular support for the regime by encouraging a particular form of Chinese nationalism, one that emphasized not so much the great achievements of Chinese civilization, but the so-called century of humiliation that began with the Opium Wars in the 1840s and ended ostensibly with the rise of the Chinese Communist power and the creation of the People's Republic in 1949. So emphasizing that century of humiliation, the bad things that were done to China by foreigners, and above all, the vital and continuing role of the CCP in restoring and upholding national dignity. All of these elements have remained in place down to the present, although their relative weights have shifted somewhat. As economic growth has slowed in recent years, China's leaders have cracked down even harder, while stepping up their use of nationalism, including, I think this is important and potentially dangerous, by courting confrontations with foreign powers in the hopes of rallying domestic support. And all of these tendencies were visible before Xi Jinping came to power, but they've become even more evident, I think, since he assumed the top positions in the party state now 5 years ago, almost 6 years ago. The expanded resources that the CCP regime has available to it have given it a widening array of options for crushing dissent and suppressing criticism of its policies, both at home and abroad. The Chinese government is moving towards implementation of a nationwide so-called social credit system that would use big data analytics to monitor the activities, track the movements, and assess the political reliability of virtually every man, woman, and child in China. This is a capability, if it ever comes to pass, that the totalitarian regimes of the last century could only dream of. But it isn't just about high technology. There's growing evidence that Beijing has built a network of detention facilities or concentration camps that may hold as many as 1 million members of China's Uyghur Muslim minority, nearly 10% of that total population, people that the regime fears may be susceptible to radicalism. Prisoners in these camps are reportedly being subjected to intense psychological pressure, a form of torture, intended to re-educate them, and many have not been heard from since being detained. And this appears to be a violation of human rights on a truly massive scale, yet to date, until very recently, very few Western governments had seen fit to comment on it, presumably because they feared damaging valuable economic relationships with China. And indeed, China's increasing wealth and the growing importance of its market have enhanced the regime's ability to exert leverage over foreigners, including both governments and private actors who dare to criticize its human rights policies or otherwise incur its wrath. Just a few examples: when the Norwegian Nobel Committee awarded the Peace Prize to a Chinese dissident in 2010, Beijing responded by freezing relations and imposing unofficial economic sanctions for 6 years. And they relented only after the Norwegian government issued an apology saying that it would, quote, do its best to avoid any future damage to bilateral relations. When the University of San Diego invited Tibet's exiled Dalai Lama to deliver a commencement address in 2017, the Chinese authorities responded by cutting aid for visiting scholars and implicitly threatening to do the same for a much larger number of Chinese students studying at UCSD. This year, when an employee of the Marriott hotel chain liked a social media tweet posted by an organization called the Friends of Tibet, Beijing responded by demanding that he be fired and that Marriott issue an apology, and it did both of those things. 30 years ago, there may have been a good case to be made for downplaying the CCP regime's mistreatment of its own people and proceeding with engagement in the belief that this would help to speed political reform, bring liberalization. And indeed, for some time, the regime seems to have gone to considerable lengths to encourage these hopes. For example, experimenting with so-called village elections that some saw as the precursors to wider reforms, and also talking of the need for more democracy, albeit when you pressed a little bit, it turned out what they were talking about was democracy within the party, not true multi-party democracy as we would understand it. But especially in the past decade, things have changed. Chinese officials are increasingly open in their dismissal of Western-style democracy and what they refer to as so-called universal values. What Xi Jinping and his colleagues have in mind is not a transitional phase of repressive rule to be followed by eventual liberalization, but an efficient, technologically enhanced, and permanent one-party dictatorship, kind of authoritarian version of the end of history. Developments in the economic sphere parallel and reflect those in the political domain. As I've suggested, from the early 1990s onward, there was an expectation in the West that economic and political reform would go hand in hand. Movement towards greater reliance on markets would encourage, and indeed, in the view of most Western experts, would require a steady reduction in the power of the party state. But this is not what's happened. Beyond a certain point, the party has proven unwilling to relinquish its grip. This is partly a reflection of ideology. Although they've learned to talk the talk of free trade and globalization and so on, China's rulers are not liberals. They don't regard growth and prosperity as ends in themselves, nor do they expect them to emerge from the workings of freely functioning markets. Like the mercantilists of earlier eras, they believe that the purpose of generating wealth is to generate power. Wealth begets power, and power begets more wealth. Resistance to thoroughgoing market reforms is also a result of the incentives that are embedded in the existing system for directing resources, in which party members and their families benefit from their access to political power. And increasingly, the CCP leadership's determination to continue on the path of so-called socialism with Chinese characteristics reflects the belief that these policies are working. Why should they change? Why should they take the advice of the West, the United States, that only wishes them ill, when in fact they seem to be doing fairly well? In retrospect, the pace of reform appears to have slowed shortly after Beijing's accession to the WTO in 2001, and in certain respects, it's gone into reverse under Xi Jinping. In spite of its commitments, China is continuing to use a mix of subsidies, tariffs, non-tariff barriers, and other measures to protect domestically based companies and to promote their fortunes in global markets. And its latest trade and industrial programs are intended to catapult it from a perennial follower to a position of leadership across an array of cutting-edge edge industries, including semiconductors, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, robotics, new materials, and so on. Because they continue to lag behind in many of these sectors, the sectors that they hope to dominate, Chinese firms, at the direction and with the assistance of the party state, have for some time been using a variety of methods to acquire the necessary technology from the advanced industrial countries, including buying foreign companies, so-called foreign direct investment in the United States, Europe, and elsewhere, compelling foreign firms to transfer core technologies in return for access to the Chinese market, which is something which is forbidden under the WTO and sometimes denied that they're doing, stealing intellectual property in massive quantities from foreign companies, research labs, and universities using cyber intrusion and other more traditional methods of industrial espionage. And the problems with all of this are threefold. Some, although not all, of the methods that I've just described represent severe distortions or outright violations of existing rules and international understandings. And there's a growing recognition, not only in the United States, but in other countries in Europe and Asia, that China has been gaming the system to its own advantage and to the disadvantage of its trading partners. Current confrontation between the United States and China over trade is not simply a function of the predilections of President Trump. Aside from the means it's using, Beijing's stated goals, as recorded in official planning documents like Made in China 2025, are contributing to this sense of concern. The regime in these planning documents has declared its intention not just to promote the fortunes of Chinese firms in a general way, but to help them to achieve a dominant position and specified market shares in a variety of cutting-edge industrial sectors, first in their heavily protected domestic markets and then overseas. And if they were to be successful, these efforts would have worrisome implications for the prosperity and future growth prospects of many other countries, including the United States. Finally, because almost all of the technologies involved have both commercial and military applications, there's the possibility that China's policies could help it to achieve a meaningful edge in the development of future weapon systems, and that this might reduce or perhaps eliminate long-standing sources of strategic advantage for the United States. Chinese rulers have long been dissatisfied with the status quo in East Asia, and in particular in the maritime domain off their eastern coasts. And among their long-standing and openly stated objectives have been the extension of mainland control over Taiwan, which the CCP regards not only as a rebellious breakaway province, but because of the demonstrated success of Taiwan's own transition to democracy over the last 30 years, as a dangerous example and an ideological threat. Assertion of control over virtually all of the water's surface features and resources in the South China Sea, as well as portions of the East China Sea. Most of these claims go back to the founding of the PRC and even before, but they've lain largely dormant until recently. And also, China's leaders have for a long time, I think, but now more openly, sought an end to America's regional alliances and its military bases in Japan and South Korea in particular. Beijing regards these as temporary artifacts of historical accident, the product of what they refer to as unequal treaties that followed the end of the Second World War, and which are now sustained by what it describes as an outdated Cold War mentality. Although Beijing has generally been cautious in saying so, the CCP leadership also clearly regards the US presence as the main obstacle to its achieving its other regional objectives, and more generally, to regaining what it sees as China's rightful place as the preponderant power in East Asia. What's changed in recent years are not so much the CCP's goals, but rather the means that it has available to pursue them, and its willingness to exercise its growing power in order to do so. Since the mid-1990s, China's rapid economic growth has enabled it to fund a wide-ranging and sustained modernization of its armed forces. Among other things, the regime has invested heavily in so-called anti-access area denial capabilities, which are basically precision conventional strike systems that are capable of hitting both fixed and mobile targets throughout the Western Pacific, including US bases and also surface vessels, including US aircraft carriers. Beijing has also begun to improve its intercontinental range nuclear strike forces in ways that could begin to call into question the credibility of the U.S. extended nuclear guarantee to its allies. And at the other end of the spectrum, it's developed and put to use so-called gray zone capabilities, Coast Guard, paramilitary, maritime construction forces that China has used to build and now to fortify a set of artificial islands in the South China Sea. The aim of China's military buildup is not so much to prepare to fight and win a war with the United States, but rather to win without fighting, to deter U.S. intervention by raising its prospective costs, to demonstrate Washington's inability to prevent the systematic expansion of China's own power and influence. I think that's a large part of the reason for the island construction campaign, was to show that we couldn't stop them. And in the process, over time, to weaken U.S. alliances by undermining confidence in our long-term, the long-term viability of our security commitments. China's economic growth has also given it an expanding array of non-military tools with which to achieve its objectives. The increasing size and centrality of the Chinese market and its rapidly expanding role as a provider of aid and investment is helping Beijing to draw others towards it. In addition to attracting with the promise of profits, however, Beijing now also has the capacity to use economic instruments to punish or merely to threaten those who defy its wishes. And it's done so repeatedly in recent years. Just one recent example, in 2017, Beijing stopped Chinese tourist groups from going to South Korea, closed dozens of South Korean stores in China, and blocked imports of some South Korean products to punish the Seoul government for agreeing to allow the basing of elements of an American ballistic missile defense radar system on South Korean soil. And in a uniquely sort of Chinese twist, they didn't declare that they were imposing sanctions because they're opposed in principle to sanctions, but they did these things anyway. And by some estimates, they succeeded in knocking something like 0.5% off South Korean GDP growth in 2017. And South Korea is a very wealthy country, and that's a lot of money. The ultimate objective of Chinese strategy appears to be to create a new regional order in Eastern Eurasia, joined together by trade, transportation, and communication infrastructure, and perhaps by some form of regional political organization, maybe something that would look like the so-called hub and spokes arrangement the United States has had, but now with Beijing at the center. And America's alliances dismantled or drained of their significance, and over time, the United States pushed to the margins, if not out of the region altogether. It's perhaps unsurprising that a rising power should want to reshape the region surrounding it in ways that better serve its interests and reflect its values. This is what the United States did in the Western Hemisphere in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and it's what Imperial Germany and Imperial Japan tried to do in Europe and East Asia, respectively, at around the same time. But, as these examples may suggest, the fact that something is predictable, and even in this sense natural, doesn't make it any less of a challenge for other countries. In this case, a weakening of the U.S. position in East Asia and the emergence of a new Sino-centric regional order would mean the subordination of America's democratic friends and allies, the likelihood of restricted commercial, physical, and virtual access to and through the world's most dynamic region, the emergence of a group of countries, including some with considerable wealth, that might support, or at a minimum would be reluctant to oppose Beijing on a range of issues, including trade and human rights, and the acquisition of a secure Eurasian base from which China could more easily project power into other regions, including some closer to the United States. And for over a century now, a central aim of American grand strategy has been to prevent the emergence of just such a situation. The ambitions of China's CCP regime are no longer limited to its immediate neighborhood. Its economic growth is now propelling it out onto the world stage, perhaps more rapidly than some of its top strategists had expected, as it seeks out markets, materials, technologies, and opportunities for productive investment. Critics have compared some of China's behavior in parts of the developing world to that of the 19th and 20th century imperial powers. So extractive economic activity in construction projects that benefit China and benefit Chinese companies more than local populations. So-called debt trap diplomacy, in which China offers loans and then takes control of resources, ports, or other valuable assets when governments can't repay their debts. And the establishment of Chinese-controlled enclaves, including for the first time last year, overseas military bases on the territory of other countries. In its pursuit of its material objectives, China's behavior may be similar to that of other great powers of the past, although some of its actions appear archaic by the standards of the 21st century. But China's activities on the global stage also have a distinctive ideological coloration and purpose. China's CCP rulers have long felt themselves to be surrounded and threatened by a structure of international institutions, norms, and rules that, at least in theory, embody liberal principles inimical to their own. And they regard these as reflecting American interests and Western preferences rather than, again, as they would put it, so-called universal values. And now they see themselves as being in a position to push back, to counteract, and if possible, to neutralize what they see as a potential existential threat to their own survival by reshaping elements of the contemporary international system. Chinese theorists have not yet advanced anything resembling a fully developed vision for what they refer to as a more democratic world order. For the time being, at least, Beijing seems to be taking a kind of a la carte approach to the existing system, supporting and seeking to exploit those portions of it that serve their interests, like the World Trade Organization, as I mentioned, the UN Security Council, ignoring that those that don't, like the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, which handed down a ruling a couple of years ago regarding China's activities in the South China Sea, which the regime didn't like and simply ignored. Trying to turn others to its own purposes. That seems to have been what they were doing with Interpol when they got one of their own people put in the top position there, but they subsequently arrested him, or kidnapped him, and brought him back to China for reasons unclear, so they seem to have blown that one. But the general idea is use those institutions, and where you can't really use them, weaken or subvert them. Institutions like the UN Commission on Human Rights that might otherwise pose a challenge to its legitimacy. The CCP regime has also begun to develop new financial institutions, like the New Development Bank, that aim to circumvent those favored by the West, and which, among other things, don't impose conditions for good governance or transparency. And Beijing has sought to promote new norms, like the idea of internet sovereignty, as compared to a free flow of information, a world in which each country has the right to control the flow of information into and out of its own borders. That are clearly designed to bolster its own efforts to block what it regards as subversive and dangerous ideas. The increased outflow of Chinese money, most notably under the auspices of Xi Jinping's signature Belt and Road Initiative, is also helping to influence the policies and institutions of countries in many parts of the developing world, making governments more supportive of Beijing's stance in international institutions, and strengthening the hand of authoritarian rulers with whom it generally prefers to do business, while fueling corruption and weakening democratic practices in places where these have yet to take firm root. And these problems are not limited to the developing world. At Xi Jinping's direction, in the last 5 years, the CCP has also stepped up its use of political warfare, or so-called United Front influence operations, and these involve a combination of techniques, including bribery and co-optation, that exploit the openness of democratic societies and are intended to shape the perceptions and attitudes of foreign business, academic, media, and political elites in ways that reduce criticism of the CCP regime and win support for its policies. And this is a global phenomenon, but it's recently begun to attract attention in Australia, New Zealand, and now in the United States as well. It's often said that Beijing doesn't seek to spread its own system of government or to encourage ideological rivalry with the West. But even if this may once have been true, I think it's no longer the case. As I've already noted, China's rulers are now openly contemptuous of Western-style democracy, and they feel emboldened to offer their own mix of market-driven economics and authoritarian politics as in Xi Jinping's words in a speech about a year ago, a new option for other countries. And this is something which China has never done, or has not done in the last 20 or 30 years, but now seems willing to do. Just as at the start of the 20th century, American policymakers set out to, in Woodrow Wilson's words, make the world safe for democracy, so at the start of the 21st century, China's leaders seek to make it safe for authoritarianism, or at least for continued CCP rule in China. And this is not only by achieving dominance in their own neighborhood, but by working to check and to roll back, if they can, the global spread of liberal democratic ideas and institutions, a trend that seemed unstoppable only a few years ago. So what I've done is to describe what I see as the CCP regime's aims and ambitions. But obviously, just because they want these things doesn't mean that they'll be able to achieve them. As China's rulers are keenly aware, they face enormous domestic challenges: slowing growth, an aging population, environmental degradation, continuing corruption, and inefficiency. In recent months, there's also been evidence that they face increasing resistance to their assertiveness from other countries, including from the United States. But this opposition, I think, is still nascent, confused, and uncoordinated. It may be because of their awareness of their own problems that China's leaders are pushing so hard to achieve some of their objectives. They see opportunity in the divisions and the preoccupations of the democracies, and I think they see opportunity in the division, as they see it, and instability and weakness of the American political system. An effective response to China's growing power and influence will require greater focus by our government, increased mobilization of resources, and above all, I think, increased cooperation with like-minded countries, because this is a problem too big, even for the United States, to handle on its own. But none of those things would be possible without greater understanding of and agreement on the nature of the challenge. So I thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to try to answer your questions.
Thanks so much for an excellent talk. I'm going to kind of moderate the questions here. So we've got, I can't see them here, but we've got at least a half hour, right?
37 minutes.
37 minutes. Great. So we've got some good time for Q&A. What am I?
I have a question. You mentioned that economic development, economic development consolidate China's authoritarian ruler rather than weaken China's authoritarian ruler. So the mirror question is whether China's economic slowdown or even the risk of the economic crisis will weaken China's political stability and change the dynamics of U.S.-China relations.
Well, that's a huge and important question. I think
What's the question?
whether, so if China's economic growth did not lead to its political liberalization, but rather to the consolidation of authoritarian rule, is it possible that the slowdown in its economic growth could weaken or undermine the regime and promote a crisis within China and potentially changes in relations with the United States? I think that's the question. I think that is possible, but I think it will take a lot of disruption in order to change the balance within Chinese society in a way that might make it conceivable that there could be major change in direction of government policy, still less any kind of liberalization. The regime, first of all, one of the reasons, I think, why the growth of the middle class, which is a real phenomenon in China, and a significant one, hasn't led to pressure for political change is partly because of the repression that I mentioned earlier, partly because of the use of nationalism to kind of capture people's imaginations and bind them to the regime, but also because of the fear of the consequences of possible instability. After all, people in the middle class now have a lot to lose, potentially, from political change, and they become supporters, essentially, of the regime, even if they don't like every aspect of what it's doing. And that wouldn't evaporate overnight, I don't think. The other thing, I guess, important to keep in mind is, as I mentioned, the regime has invested enormous resources in being able to maintain control and repress dissent. I don't see any likelihood in the foreseeable future of any kind of pressure from below that would have a meaningful impact on the system. I don't see a revolution, a popular revolution happening in China. I guess there's a question about whether there might emerge at some point people in the Chinese system at the top who favored a movement towards political liberalization. But as far as we can tell, there are no such people now. There might have been once in the 1980s, but they lost and were purged after Tiananmen. And as far as I'm aware, there's no one who even appears remotely to be sympathetic to any of these so-called universal values or ideas about democracy. So I don't see it happening. I think China could have internal strife. In 2008, at the time of the onset of the global financial crisis, the regime braced itself for serious unrest and was prepared for widespread labor unrest and so on. But it was able to avoid that, not only because of the strengthening of the tools of repression, but also because the regime pumped enormous amounts of money into the economy to keep it going. And I think their first impulse now will be to do the same thing, which just means their problems are going to get worse in the long run, even if they survive the current crisis.
Wow. Lots to chew on there, some really great stuff. Jamie, I had you...
Yeah, I actually have a couple of questions. One of them is to sort of put a point on something which you, I think, developed to a certain extent in your talk, and it has to do with China's economic policy, which you characterized as mercantilist, is based on tariffs and non-tariff barriers, theft of technology, industrial policy. There was a time when that complex of policies had a name. It was called the American system. It also was arguably the basis for the Japanese redevelopment following the Second World War, and for what later became the East Asian miracle, at least in some parts. So I'm wondering, the first question is, why would anyone from the Chinese point of view consider it to be kind of a standpoint of a priori legitimacy to accept the rules that we would like them to accept at the present time? It seems to me hard to argue that case, given the history that I think everybody understands. The second question is about the American strategy with respect to this. From the early mid-1950s until the end of the Cold War, U.S. strategy was based in large part on balancing the relationship between China and the Soviet Union, China and Russia. We're now in the process, it seems to me, you didn't mention Russia in your talk, but we're in the process of developing, at least arguing for, and I think you make the case with respect to China, for quite hostile relationships with both of them at the same time. And I'm wondering if you think that's likely to be a winning strategy, especially with respect to Eurasia.
Well, let me take the second first. I don't think it's us that's primarily responsible for the current levels of tension between the West and Russia, for example, nor do I think we're primarily responsible for the turn in relations between ourselves and China. We're responding to things that they're doing and have been doing for some time. I don't see at the moment any serious prospect of doing a reverse Kissinger, sort of turning Russia against China, which some people have talked about. Not that it wouldn't be advantageous to us if that were possible, because it would deny China a secure interior frontier. It might deny them access to the resources that they currently obtain from the Russians. So it might be good from a strategic point of view. But as seen from both Moscow and Beijing, the West is the main threat to both of them. They're drawn together by a kind of anti-ideology, not joined together or divided as the Soviet Union and the PRC were during much of the Cold War by what was supposed to be a common ideology. They don't have a common ideology, but they have a common antipathy to liberal democracy and the Western system, which they see as being primarily promoted by the United States for its own selfish interests. So I think they're drawn together, and they have a variety of more practical concerns about trade, about exchange of military technology, that's going to keep them together for some time to come. So I think we don't have much of a choice, and they are cooperating in various ways, tacitly and explicitly, to try to weaken and divide the West, and I think we have to respond accordingly. I don't think Russia is anything like the kind of challenge in the long run that China is, because of its own internal weaknesses. And I don't think if we were able, which I think we should be able, to coordinate the efforts of the democracies around Eurasia, with the United States as the sort of maritime power that stands behind that, to counter the efforts of China and Russia separately and together to achieve their objectives. I think, in any event, I think that's the problem we face. We can't get out of it by coming up with clever schemes. As far as China's economic policy, I mean, I would quibble a bit with your characterization of what they're doing as, for example, similar to the American system. I mean, there's a big difference.
The US was based on tariffs.
It was, but it wasn't a one-party regime that exercised power over every activity going on within its borders. A little bit different. As far as the legitimacy, I mean, certainly the Chinese don't accept the legitimacy of the existing system. They don't like the demands that the United States is making of them. They reject the claims that they're doing anything that's unfair or wrong. I guess there are two answers to that, two responses to that. One is, they may not like it, but they did sign up to a series of agreements, which, as I said, I think increasingly people in the West now see that they've bent, if not broken, they've taken advantage of the slow process of resolving disputes. They've found ways around the restrictions on the extraction of technology, and so on. So they signed up for this, and now the problem is that it's become clear that they don't intend to live up to some of those commitments, and they feel they have the power to sort of step out and say, we're just not going to do it the way that you wanted us to do it. The other thing I would say, though, is, and this is going back, you raised Japan. I think the Japan example is a very interesting one. Because, of course, in certain respects, as seen from the United States, some of the problems that we think we have with China are similar to those that people thought we had with Japan in the 1970s and 1980s, growing out of the industrial policies and trade policies that Japan was pursuing at that time. And there are some similarities, but I think what's most notable is the differences. So our problem with China grows out of the fact that it is pursuing these kinds of trade and industrial policies, but also that it's huge by comparison to Japan, and therefore has leverage and the possibility of making some of these policies work in a way that I think the Japanese couldn't. And then last but not least, of course, that they're a strategic rival of ours rather than an ally. In the end, Japan wasn't going to strike out on its own. It was dependent on the United States and had to make adjustments in its economic policies as a reflection of that fact. And China, of course, is in a very different situation. Indeed, I think they see the demands that we are now making of them as intended not primarily to serve an economic purpose, but to serve a strategic purpose. They think we're out to undermine them, weaken them, prevent them from rising, and are trying to get them to do things that will prevent them from staying on the trajectory that they've been following. They sort of conveniently ignore or downplay the fact that they have gotten to where they've gotten in large part because the United States has been so willing to engage in trade and investment with them.
But before we go here, I'm going to use my position and just ask a quick follow-up question to Jamie's first point. We just saw a meeting of the quadrilateral, sort of so-called quadrilateral, which for those who are unfamiliar, is a grouping of the United States, India, Australia, and Japan. Yes, of course, Japan. So is that, I don't want to kind of prejudice your answer here, so maybe I can ask it in the most unobtrusive way possible. So what does that mean?
Yeah.
Does it mean anything? Where is it going? How do the Chinese perceive it, and what does it mean for the strategic rivalry that Jamie elucidated in his first point?
Well, one thing it tells you is that theorists of international relations are actually right about some things, and one of the things I think they're right about is that there's a tendency towards balance of power. So when a power grows stronger, there's an inclination on the part of others that may feel themselves threatened by its growing strength to cooperate with one another, and in some cases overcome outstanding differences in order to maintain an effective balance. So I think a lot of what we see going on in the region, putting aside whatever the United States is doing, takes that form. So there's bilateral cooperation between Japan and India, between Japan and Australia, between India and Australia, between Japan and Vietnam. You know, there's a sort of overlapping network of connections that are growing stronger, and all of which are intended ultimately to present something of a balance in China's growing strength. Two thoughts on that. One, none of this can work without the United States, because no one or combination of those powers is sufficiently strong to be able to counter China's growing power on their own. And two, international relations theorists are right that balances of power tend to form, but one thing they sometimes gloss over, which the historians would remind us, is that they don't always form quickly. They don't always form quickly enough to prevent conflict. And that has to be a concern. The Quad is great, but if you look at how long it's taken for the United States and Japan, which have been treaty allies for decades, to actually get to kind of position of close coordination of their defense planning and exchange of intelligence and so on, you'd be cautious in expecting that any grouping that has just emerged will actually be very effective, certainly not in military terms, in countering a single opponent that has a great deal of strength in a central position. But overall, it's good news, because what we have to encourage is a balance to maintain deterrence, to maintain stability. China doesn't want that because they want to be the dominant power in the region.
And of course, historians would also remind us that China has a lot of experience in separating these kinds of
Yes.
coalitions
And that's one of the reasons why balances don't always form properly, because if you're dealing with a clever opponent, they'll try to pick off one or the other, to lure one away, to weaken the connections among them. And I think that's what the Chinese, they've been trying to do that for a while. They're going to try even harder now.
Interesting. Over here, introduce yourself here.
Larry O'Brien, I'm an alumnus of the LPJ school, and Aaron, I guess the question I have is, for years, China kind of went along with this ambitious, assertive agenda without much resistance from anybody. Very recently, that's changed, whether it's, you know, The Economist, how the West got China wrong, some of the themes you've touched upon, and much more recently, Vice President Pence's rather aggressive and assertive speech. Which leads to the question, how important is China controlling the external narrative? Because that seems to have gotten away from them rather dramatically in the last year or more. And how much of a constraint or issue is that for them as they continue with these aims and objectives you've outlined?
Well, it's an excellent question, and let me start at the end and say it is very important to them, potentially, to have lost control of that narrative. I think they felt that I don't know if they felt they were controlling it, but it was going in a direction that was more or less favorable to them for some time, from the early 1990s and even before, until fairly recently. There are really two questions, and we were talking about this at dinner last night. One is, why did it take so long for the United States and others to respond to what I think was evidently an emerging challenge going back decades, really? First, why did it take so long, and why is it happening now? What is it that's changed now? And those are huge questions that I can't give a short answer to, but I think on the first, there were a lot of vested interests in pursuing the economic relationship with China because it was profitable. And there was also this kind of ideological overlay, this belief that, as I mentioned, that ultimately, inevitably, economic development and trade would lead to liberalization, and when China became a democracy, whatever problems there might be resulting from its growing strength would evaporate, because democracies tend to get along. So, I don't know, I don't want to assign weight to interests versus ideas, but they were both important. And there was a kind of consensus, and a consensus reinforced by some influential figures that held that we shouldn't overreact to what China was doing, and in the long run, time was on our side. So why is that seemingly breaking down now? I think it may be the straw that broke the camel's back, and maybe there's not just one straw. But there has been some inclination on the part of the professional China watching community to say it's all Xi Jinping. And things just started to go south when he came in. And that's sort of a convenient excuse. I don't think that's the case. I think these tendencies and trends were evident before. Nevertheless, it's true that he has behaved in ways that make it easier for others, depending on how you look at it, either to present him as a villain or to recognize that he is in fact pursuing an agenda which is inimical to our own. So the increase in activity in the South China Sea, the particular way in which China has launched Belt and Road, the fact that in this Made in China 2025, they actually mention numerical targets, which are obviously going to be threatening to other countries that didn't really have to do that. The revelations about United Front activities, the fact that I think they're behaving in a way that suggests they no longer have to be as cautious as they once were, has started to arouse the concern of people in the West. I think that really started with the financial crisis in 2008 and led to a shift in the kind of consensus view in China about the trends, the long-term trends, the belief that the United States was in accelerating relative decline, which gave China a chance to emerge. I don't think they were very impressed by the pivot or by the initial responses of the Obama administration, so they continued in the direction that they were going. Two last thoughts on this. So why is it happening now? I think the piece of this that's changed the most, or is most consequential, is the fraying or the beginning of the unraveling of what had been a pretty strong consensus in the United States, in the business community, particularly in the kind of higher tech industries and financial services, supportive of the status quo and the pursuit of policies of engagement. That was really the ballast when the big battles were fought over most favored nation status or over WTO. It was those groups that were most influential, and then representatives of some of them found their way into high positions in government, pursued policies that were perfectly consistent with their views about what was not only best for the financial services industry, but best for the United States. Those people have started to peel off, whether it's because of growing concerns over theft and intellectual property, the recognition of China's ambitions, not only to tag behind, but to overtake, frustration over actually getting access to and being able to operate profitably in the Chinese environment. That's been building for a while, and that removed one of the struts that you would have expected to hold this all in place. I mean, whatever you think of what President Trump has done, you might have expected a few years ago much more vocal opposition to this from a variety of familiar figures in the business community. In fact, instead, what you see is former Secretary of the Treasury Paulson giving a speech in front of an audience that contained many Chinese dignitaries and basically saying, this is your fault. You guys didn't change, you need to change. You can't expect that our policies are going to continue the way that they were. And that's the X factor or the T factor also. I mean, the fact that it's Trump, and Trump has been willing to do some things that I think other more sort of mainstream political leaders might not have done. The jury is out over how it's all going to work out, but it's had the effect of accelerating that shift. And what's been revealed is that a lot of people are very unhappy with what China's been doing. And even if they don't like the Trump administration or they're not crazy about this or that policy, they're not saying he's fundamentally wrong to point the finger at China, particularly on the economic issues. So it'll be a question that occupies historians for a long time to come.
The amazing path-dependent behavior
Yeah.
until a certain event kind of changes. And,
Right.
and this is, of course, very different than what we study in school. We think of this kind of updating behavior. We update ourselves with recent facts. But this turns
Yeah.
more like a religious conversion.
That's
you're
right.
describing.
And just two quick things. One, I mentioned the mistreatment of the Uyghurs. I think that's going to have a galvanizing effect in a way that some of these other things perhaps didn't. And also, even though it may not be as important as it's made out to be, Xi Jinping kind of making himself president for life last year, I think really took people aback.
Let me see if I can get a student here real quick. Go ahead.
I'm Shahir. I'm an undergraduate at the CCP. So what's on the CCP's vision of a Chinese world order? Is it fully developed yet? As time goes on, that vision starts developing. My internal divisions between the CCP leaders over what that vision should look like develop, and is that a possible strategic opportunity for America?
On the first part, I don't think this vision is fully developed. And I think it's partly because China's power has grown so rapidly and the world has changed so rapidly that they find themselves somewhat lagging in their thinking, and they acknowledge this. Fu Ying gave a speech last year in which he basically said, this has kind of come up on us rapidly, and we need to catch up in our thinking about what we want the world to look like. They're thinking about what they want Asia to look like is very highly developed, and I think we're beginning to see that now emerge. But the rest of the world, not so clear. And I think that's going to take some time. Part of the problem is, I don't think, the Chinese are students of history, they're students of our history, they're students of imperial history, and they're very intent on avoiding what they see as American mistakes. I think ultimately they would like to displace the United States as the preponderant world power, but they want to do it in their own way. And in particular, they don't want to take on responsibility for maintaining order or providing aid or doing all the things that has gotten the United States bogged down in various parts of the world. But they haven't figured out exactly how they're going to do that yet. As to whether there would be divisions, there might be, although I don't know that that would be the most pressing issue. I think that probably there are other things that that people in the regime might take different stances on. Partly because this is such a long-term proposition, and I think as long as they continue to grow and believe that their power and resources are increasing, they're not making it up as they go along, but they're learning and adapting and doing things to try to reshape those aspects of this current system that they don't like, and then ultimately to replace them with something else. I don't see this as the big divisive issue. At this point, it's just sort of recently moved out of the purely academic sphere, I think. I mean, there were people, Shui Tong and others 10 years ago beginning to talk about this stuff. But it's only recently, I think, that the leadership has gotten engaged with it. But it's a long-term problem. They have lots of other things to disagree about.
Well, one point to also mention is that the Chinese conception of strategy is somewhat different, right? We, in the West, we tend to think we have an objective and we're gonna have a strategy to meet that objective. But I think from my understanding, when Chinese think about strategy, they also think about the propensity of things, right? Is the wind going in your favor? Are things working with you? Then you take a certain set of actions. But if things are moving against you, you're not going to take the same actions you would if things are going for you. So I would say their strategy being more reactive and more willing to, as Deng Xiaoping called it, feel the stones to cross the river. If you don't feel a stone, you step back, right? So I don't know that there's a master blueprint, I would agree, sitting somewhere where they say, aha, according to our plan. I think it's more about judging opportunities, seeking opportunities, and taking advantage of them when they happen. But that would be my addition.
I think it's adaptive. So reactive suggests they're more passive than I think they are. But yeah, I think that's right. One lesson that I take from that insight, which I agree with, is you should be very cautious. There's always a tendency in Western commentary to say, aha, they've been foiled again. People are complaining about Belt and Road or whatever it is. Well, they expect opposition. They expect setbacks. They expect to have to adjust and adapt and learn. They're not always great at it. They can have a tin ear. They can make terrible mistakes, and they will. But the game isn't over. There's never a last move. That's sort of a fallacy of Western commentary. And so I would be cautious about premature judgments about the failure of what they're trying to do.
Yeah, no, that's great. Josh, you had your hand up there, and then I'll come up here.
So you kind of alluded with the balancing coalition to what's the appropriate strategy going forward, but it seems like John Mearsheimer's prescription from years ago of trying to constrain China's rise seems a little unlikely or outdated. Tom Ryan has talked about sort of embracing a variety of measures short of war to constrain their ambition for a regional sphere of influence. But I think as he's noted, unlike, say, rivalry with the Soviet Union, there's great interdependence between the U.S. and China, supply chain integration or issues like climate change. And so, a purely confrontational strategy would be counterproductive. So what then?
Well, I'm not sure that it would be counterproductive. It would be costly. I think what we're headed towards is, first, an increase in the balancing part of if you think about those two parts of the American strategy, balancing and engagement, we're ramping up the balancing part. So we're going to increase defense spending, we're trying to increase the size of the Navy, we're strengthening alliances, so it's military and diplomatic. And that's been going on for a while. That's not new. The Obama administration was trying to do that with the pivot. they made some progress on it. I think we're more open about that. We're saying that that's what we're doing instead of denying it. We're saying China is a great power competitor, which is something we didn't say before. On the engagement side, I think what's happening and what's going to happen more is that we're constricting engagement. And that's something previous administrations have not been willing to do. And I think we see that coming on the economic side and on the political side as well. So the political warfare issue I mentioned. The economic side, I think, is really, that's where the major questions are. And that's, yes, that is a very substantial difference between the situation that existed between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War and the situation that exists now. The Soviets, in retrospect, were our best allies. You know, they took measures for ideological and other reasons that actually weakened them in the long run. They believed in autarky, and it didn't work. The Chinese are going in exactly the opposite direction, or they have been. But they too have been worried for a long time about the implications for their security of being too engaged and too dependent on the West. And I think, in fact, this move towards at least partial disengagement, which we see happening now, begins with them. The measures that they've been taking for a while to limit, restrict access of Western companies and control information and technology industries and so on. And some of what we're doing is kind of a response to that. So I think what's likely to emerge is a world in which there is some greater degree of economic separation between China on the one hand, the United States on the other. And the big question is, who else is going to be included on either side of that? Will the United States be able to cooperate with our European allies, with our Asian democratic allies? If we can, we have a very large chunk of the global pie. EU, what used to be NAFTA, and TPP is together 65% of global GDP at this point, and China's only 15%. So if we were cooperating with one another, we'd have a lot of strength and a lot of weight. It won't be a total separation, I don't think, unless and until there really is some kind of crisis or confrontation. But there will be less engagement between, higher barriers between, and an effort on the part of both to kind of strengthen and build their own spheres or blocks. It's less efficient. It's not going to be, it'll be more costly in many ways, and especially the adjustment, if what's happening now, companies moving production facilities out of China to evade tariffs, the reallocation of supply chains, it's going to be costly. But, and this is the, I think for me, the overarching message, politics in the end dominates economics, at least in the medium term. And the arrangements that have evolved and exist now are the function of political choices that were made in the United States and China over a period of 25-some years. They're not the only way the world could be organized. They're not even the only efficient way that it could be organized. They are efficient under existing political conditions, but those political conditions are now changing. So I think we may be coming to the end of a period of something that could be described as globalization and moving back towards a situation in which there's greater separation of economic spheres.
For what it's worth, I've heard that same thing in Beijing by scholars at Renmin University. They called it two different solar systems. That was the kind of term they used, right? Create a competitive solar system, and they talked about Belt and Road being an essential part of that. So this fits very well with what I was hearing there. Now I've got, let's take three questions
Sure.
and you can kind of group them together. So I have this young lady up here, this young lady down here, and this, all right, well, you guys can arm wrestle for it. No, maybe we'll take four if that's not
That's
too many.
fine. That's
Okay,
fine.
and these two young gentlemen right here. So why don't you start us off? And try to keep it to one question per person, otherwise we can get out of hand.
You seem doubtful about the surrounding Asian countries' ability to balance China's power. How optimistic are you that the U.S. and the West will be able to stop the authoritarian expansion without great cost to us and the West?
So with regards to the idea that China kind of lures away unsuspecting regional powers. Xi and Abe just met very recently, and people have been talking about quiet accommodations being made in U.S. and Japanese relations and with other powers in the region. How do you think the Trump administration, being so vocal and being so forward and aggressive, is going to change the way other regional powers accommodate China?
Great, and then these two gentlemen here.
On a similar note, China's long been planning for and preparing for the United States to get more combative as China reaches that precipice of passing. At the same time, the administration thinks, and there's starting to be headlines that say we push them to the brink of making concessions. What gives?
I'm sorry, meaning what? Just,
Anything in your analysis?
okay, so is that gonna happen or not? Is that,
With the
Okay.
G20 coming up, there's been a lot of
Okay,
headlines
all
that
right.
say there's gonna be a breakthrough deal.
okay,
Is there a deal? What kind of deal?
yeah, very good,
Any
thank you.
questions?
Okay.
Okay, good. Professor Galbraith used the word strategy, and you've touched on strategy as far as a U.S. or Western confrontation or response to China. To what extent could you list the bullet points or the ingredients of this new plan, which would be appropriate to have one of two objectives? Would it be to make sure that the United States and the Western powers are always superior, or to accommodate a gradual equalization, if you will, of a bipolar polar system? And within that, to what extent was getting out the TTP an error?
Okay. Let me take a bit of order. So on the first one, how optimistic am I? I think in the long run, I am optimistic about the ability of the democracies to defend their own interest. I don't think it's going to be easy. I said it's going to be costly to do some of the things that I think we're going to need to do. I worry at this point more about our internal divisions and uncertainties than I do about the capacities of our opponents. Because we, as I indicated, I think we, both in this country and certainly collectively with other democratic countries, have more than sufficient resources and capacity to deal with this challenge. But I'm not sure that we're going to mobilize it in a timely fashion. And in that sense, I guess this undermines my optimism, but reminds me a little bit of the 1930s, that there's this looming problem, but the democratic countries are preoccupied with their own difficulties and their own divisions. But I think in the long run, we'll be okay, partly because I think the Chinese themselves have such enormous challenges, and I don't think they've got, as much as they may think that they have ways around some of these problems, I'm not confident that they do. On other Asian countries, so Japan and China, I would expect that others in the region, to varying degrees, and this has been going on for a while, will try to, they always say don't make choices, we want to get along with both sides. Well, there's reason for that from where they sit. China is their number one trading partner. They don't want to be in a position of being cut off from that. At this point, I think they do worry about where the United States is going, how reliable we are. They don't want to be dragged into conflicts by this administration, not to mention the fact that, at least as far as Japan, it was true for Korea as well, for a while, the administration has been doing things on the trade front that antagonize them. That doesn't seem very rational in terms of some overarching strategy. All of that said, I don't think many of the countries, and in particular Japan, the most important one, really feel that they have an alternative at this point, but to stick as close as possible to the United States. Yeah, they'll try to deal with China, but they know they can't live comfortably in a region where China is the dominant power. The Chinese have made that very clear to them in the way that they treat them. The Koreans too, interestingly, although there's some flirtation with that 10 or 15 years ago. Look at public opinion polls and who are people worried about? It's China, it's not the United States, it's even more China than North Korea. And to varying degrees, other countries in the region, the Australians too, don't want to choose. Well, they don't want to, they've already chosen. They chose a long time ago, and they're on the side of the democratic countries. They need to do a lot of business with China, but China needs them too. So I'm not too surprised by this. How the U.S. will respond, nowadays you can't always be sure, but I think certainly the people who are most responsible for making the policy will recognize immediately that countries are going to pursue their interests. We have to reassure them and also draw them in, make sure they understand our position, our commitment. But I don't think we need to work very hard to convince them that China is a challenge or even a threat to their interests in the long run. The G20, I'm interested by your initial point where you say that China's been preparing for a long time for this. I agree with that. I think that's not adequately understood. I think actually that the whole idea of a 20-year window or period of strategic opportunity that they announced as part of their formal doctrine in 2002, was supposed to run out in 2022. What was going to come after it? Some more intense competition. I think from the Chinese perspective, it's arrived a little bit early, and that's a problem for them, but I don't think they're shocked by this. They've been expecting it. I think that they've perhaps been a little surprised that we haven't pushed back harder until now. As far as what's going to happen at this meeting, who knows? I guess the smart money now is saying the likelihood of a real deal of any kind is vanishingly small. The likelihood of a breakdown where nothing happens and they say harsh words to one another is not trivial. The highest probability outcome is some kind of ceasefire where both sides agree not to take further measures to restrict trade, to leave the existing measures in place, and to set up some kind of dialogue mechanism, negotiate, whatever, which is really just kicking the can down the road. The reason for thinking that that's plausible is that it would certainly be in China's interests for us not to impose further restrictions, but it might also be in the interests of the Trump administration to not do that, because the next steps in that process are going to have even more of an impact on American consumers, and pretty quickly that's going to become unpopular. So if I had to bet, I would say maybe something like that, but it doesn't solve the problem, and I don't think the problem is going to be solved simply through negotiation. I think it's going to result in this at least partial separation. U.S. strategy. Well, the easy part of that question is TPP. I think it was a mistake to pull out of TPP. I think it was a reflection of the president's own distaste, for whatever reason, for multilateral agreements, but also the kind of the tea leaves politically that suggested that there wasn't a great enthusiasm for this, and there were people who had been told that their own personal problems have to do with too much trade and too many imports. That was true in the Democratic Party as well. It was, from a strategic point of view, I think, a mistake. As far as U.S. strategy, we don't have time to go through all the elements. I did write an article in which I tried to do this, which is in Survival, the June issue, I think June-July issue. So try to say, well, what would it look like? But the question, I think, really was about the objectives. What are the endpoints, the goals? So I think in the short term, it's counterbalancing. We have to meet this thrust and defend ourselves against it and improve our position and secure the positions of our friends and allies in the face of China's efforts to alter the status quo in ways that are not acceptable to us. And we may have to do that for a while. You're not supposed to say containment. This is one of these things. And you're not supposed to use the term Cold War. And there are good reasons for that. But it starts to look a bit like that. You don't think you're going to resolve it in the short term, but you're also not going to give way in certain places on certain issues. So you're going to have to butt heads, and you have to make sure that your strength is sufficient to secure your position. As to what the long-term resolution of that is, I think our ultimate objective, whether it's achievable or not, is not dissimilar to the one that Kennan laid out in his X article in 1946. We said, to paraphrase Kennan, in this case, we have to await the gradual mellowing or the breakup of the power of the Chinese Communist Party. I think, that, as I've tried to say all through my remarks, the root cause of the problem is the character of the Chinese regime. Unless and until that changes, I don't see us having a good, stable, friendly, cooperative relationship with China. It may not change. It may not change for a long time. And we'll have to live with that. But we're at a point now where we can't any longer delude ourselves about this impending happy ending to the story of our engagement with China.
Well, with that excellent remark, I want to thank the Brumley Speaker Series.